Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, whenever you've chosen to join us. And welcome, dear friends, welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tarpon Springs virtual service. My name is BettyLou Cummins, and I'm delighted to be your service associate today. We offer a warm welcome to all who are with us in our virtual reality. We welcome all thoughtful people to journey through life's mystery with us, whatever your religious background or current belief, whatever your race, ethnicity, sexual or gender identity, lifestyle, or circumstances. With us, may you walk the way of holiness and happiness, justice and service, and through your time in our presence, may you feel the blessings of love. We believe that we need not think alike to love alike. And now let us come to the silence and this moment with our chalice lighting.
We will now have our story for all ages by Reverend Jim.
Hello, everyone. You've come to know by now, I think, that I'm fairly fond of Shel Silverstein, but he's not the only one who writes interesting poems and bits of wisdom for young people and for some of us older folks alike. Another fellow is a man called Jack Preletsky, and I'd like to share one of his poems this morning. It seems perhaps a little apropos these days. It's titled, "My Brother is as Generous as Anyone Could Be." My brother is as generous as anyone could be. For everything he's ever had, he's always shared with me. He has loaned me his binoculars, his new computer games, and his wind-up walking dragon that breathes artificial flames. I've been grateful for his robots, for his giant teddy bear, but not for certain other things I'd hoped he'd never share, though I'm glad he shared his rockets and his magic jumping rocks. I wish my brother hadn't shared his case of chicken pox. Fun.
Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the light of love surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the light of love surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. Now for some words of inspiration from Reverend Bob.
Thank you, Bonnie. Mary Oliver has been one of my favorite poets for a long time. I can remember her giving the Ware Lecture at our annual Unitarian Universalist General Assembly more than a decade ago. I think it was in Fort Worth. It was more a marathon poetry reading than a lecture, and it was absolutely delightful. She passed away last year, but her words live on. In fact, if you do an internet search, you can easily find YouTube videos of Mary reading her own works. Many of Mary Oliver's collections were published by our own Beacon Press, and several of her poems found their way into our gray hymnal as readings. I would like to share two of her poems today, the first of which appears in our hymnal and is titled Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Wherever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Another of my favorites, which relates to my message today, is The Old Poets of China. To me, it speaks of how we once could retreat into ourselves, to isolate ourselves in the world, something we can no longer really do. Wherever I am, the world comes after me. It offers me its busyness. It does not believe that I do not want it. Now I understand why the old poets of China went so far and high into the mountains, then crept into the pale mist. Let us enter together into a moment of silence. And amen.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blowing the wind, rise in the sea. Move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots moving grows, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me. The song I would like to do is by an Irish singer-songwriter, Ian Callanan. He performed a concert and gave a workshop down in St. Petersburg several years ago. And this was my favorite song that he wrote. Strangers standing disturb me in the night. You have needs I can't ignore. You have eyes that speak your plight. Do I know you, nameless face, battered woman detainee, hungry youth, their sickness case, jobless parent refugee? Do I know you, nameless face? You are strange in speech and dress. You have children at your side. You are not like one of us. You have begged away your pride. If you passed across my screen, I might switch you out of sight. Worlds away you might have been, yet you stand here in the night. Do I know you, nameless face? I am fearful of your claim, yet I cannot turn away. Stranger with a foreign name, are you angel come to stay? You are messenger and guest. You're the face I can't ignore. You're my own compassion's test. Stranger standing at my door. You, the stranger, I can't ignore. You, the stranger, I can't ignore. The offering for the work and welfare of this church will now be given and received. Please go to our website, uutarpon.org, or mail your offering to 57 Reed Street. The complete address is on your screen. I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world of woe. There is no sorrow, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go. I'm going there to see my brother. I'm going there no more to roam. I'm just a going over Jordan. I'm only going over. We'll now have our message for the day.
Thank you, Bonnie. Good morning. Perhaps you know that I've agreed to participate in a couple of these virtual church services each month until at least this congregation can once again safely assemble face-to-face on Sunday mornings. We want to return to normal practices as soon as is prudent, given the dangers of the coronavirus. Public health officials want us to continue to hunker down, to flatten the curve. Some politicians, on the other hand, are more concerned with promoting economic activity than with public health. Indeed, they seem willing to invite more suffering and dying in the interest of getting people back to work. Potential deaths and debilitating illness are merely costs of doing business. Too bad if you get sick, really too bad if you die. We Unitarian Universalists hold life to be sacred. It's our first principle, respect for the inherent worth and dignity of every person, not only people we agree with, but everyone. And worth means value. How much value? I would respond, life is priceless. To me, this means that UUs lean toward staying closed. But that should not mean that we are oblivious to people needing to be able to participate in the economy. Indeed, it is ethically complicated. This pandemic raises many ethical issues for us. We sense that life is not simply going to return to the old ways, and we need to prepare ourselves. I believe that we should think about abiding ethical questions as we journey forward, and I plan to devote some of my messages to this theme. We won't cover every topic that might assure peace and justice in the post-pandemic world, but journeys, even daunting ones, originate with one step. So let us begin. In Mary Oliver's words, there was a time when we could hide ourselves high in the mountains, creeping into the pale mist to lose ourselves. This is true no longer. This pandemic underscores the interdependence of all the world's people and environments. It's what our seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence, is about. There is immense suffering all over the world, some near and some far away. We may know some of those who suffer, but they are mostly strangers. What do we owe them as fellow human beings, given our UU ethical worldview? For me, cosmopolitanism goes a long way toward answering this question. And a philosophy professor named Kwame Anthony Appiah skillfully argues this concept in his book titled Cosmopolitanism. So what is cosmopolitanism? Well, it's got nothing to do with a magazine you see at the grocery checkout, nor is it about people who happen to live in big cities. The term cosmopolitan derives from the Greek cosmos, meaning world, and polites, meaning citizen. A cosmopolitan then is a citizen of the world, a globally conscious person. Ancient philosophers considered it a transcendent love for humankind. When asked where he came from, Diogenes the Cynic is said to have responded, "I am a citizen of the world." The great philosopher from the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant, made a case for cosmopolitanism as a principle in support of universal hospitality. Contemporary philosophers often characterize cosmopolitanism as a necessary element of the human rights movement because of its emphasis on human identity. Some see an emerging global phase of civilization that makes possible our self-identification as global citizens and our joining together in some fashion. However, globalization is not cosmopolitanism. Globalization in modern parlance refers to economic relationships, trade, and not to cultural, social, political, or environmental values that are integral to the cosmopolitan view. Of course, globalist has become one of the latest insults used by political right-wingers. They use it as the antithesis to nationalism. Their intent is divisive. We, the nationalists, are the good guys, and you globalists are traitorous because you care about all those deplorable foreigners. I believe they mean cosmopolitanism rather than globalism, but you cannot argue with these folks. Anyway, nationalism is not the opposite of cosmopolitanism. Rather, the opposite is, in my view, radical narcissism, where one is so self-absorbed that they cannot care about anyone else. Professor Appiah possesses strong cosmopolitan credentials himself. His father was a Ghanaian diplomat with close tribal ties, his mother an Englishwoman. He now teaches philosophy at NYU and writes the weekly ethics column in the New York Times Magazine. There are two main threads to cosmopolitanism. First, we have obligations to people outside our families and beyond our borders. And second, we take a non-judgmental interest in their practices so as to learn from our differences. This means we should not expect global human diversity to converge on some homogeneous form of living. Multiculturalism rules. Many organizations promote practical cosmopolitanism and help strangers around the world. Several are Amnesty International, which seeks justice for political prisoners. Doctors Without Borders, which brings medical treatment to people whose lands are ravaged by civil strife. And our own Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which brings some of the fruits of modernity to impoverished regions. These and other organizations answer in their own ways the question, what do we owe the stranger? Our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, is perfectly congruent with cosmopolitanism. We as UUs are called to model a cosmopolitan outlook. Strangers matter. Yet we sometimes experience dissonance in reflecting on our first principle. What about historical characters like Hitler and Stalin? Inherent worth? Appiah characterizes them as anti-cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitanism, as an affinity for all humanity, was their enemy. Their loyalty to a small portion of humanity precluded loyalty to all of humanity. Maybe, and this is a stretch, their worth lies in providing evidence of the terrible things that can happen when local loyalties cause people to forget that we all have universal responsibilities. Moreover, cosmopolitanism clearly embraces our seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence. All the world is interdependent. Cosmopolitanism suggests we owe non-judgmental respect for human practices, even when we find them undesirable, even reprehensible. A contemporary example might be the so-called wet markets and butchering of wild animals, which led to the current pandemic. We find this practice intolerable. By the way, such markets exist in New York City as well as in China. But cosmopolitanism asks that we recognize our differences, learn from them, and not prejudge the culture that is home to those differences. We owe the stranger our respect, perhaps most especially when we encounter something that upsets our own sensibilities, when respect perhaps seems impossible. Do we simply accept such barbaric practices? Can't we force change somehow? No, says Appiah. The way to change such practices is to appeal to honor, he asserts. And therein lies a topic we'll have to take up another time. Beyond respect for difference, cosmopolitanism recognizes that people have basic needs. We could interpret this as implying that we who have more than we need should voluntarily redistribute our excess. But it is more complicated than that. Adam Smith, another Enlightenment philosopher, observed that we are apt to get far more upset about, say, the imminent loss of our little finger than we are about a terrible disaster that threatens thousands of lives in some distant land. Indeed, Smith argued, if we could somehow sacrifice those distant thousands and thereby save our little finger, many would not hesitate. Smith's point, and Appiah pragmatically agrees, is that distance is an important factor in our cosmopolitanism. What happens to us, our families, our neighbors, our countrymen, is more important than the same misfortune that might befall people very far away. The bottom line is that we're typically more willing to help local hurricane victims than victims of some Asian typhoon because of proximity. In other words, it is human nature to do more for nearby strangers than for more distant ones. It's an answer of sorts to our basic question about how much we owe. Less at greater distance? Or at least that seems to be a response consistent with human nature. It's why we focus our thanks on local grocery store clerks, ER nurses, and all the others battling for public health. It's why our quilting group makes masks for people in this community, and why we contribute to the local food bank. But is there a way to specify how much we owe strangers in dollar terms? Perhaps. But we'll need to take this up too sometime later. For now, we see that our cosmopolitanism means that we owe strangers our respect and moral support. Pretty simple requirements. But as we work our way through this world health crisis, we encounter people who are unwilling to go this far. I believe that our work is cut out for us, and it's not going to be easy. May we, nevertheless, persevere in our ethical quest to figure out what we owe our neighbors, both near and far. Some years ago, I remember discussing what we owe the stranger with a friend, a history prof. I realized that there would be no definitive, easy answer. I said to him, you know, there really is no way to answer this question unequivocally. How much do we owe the stranger? Ever thoughtful, his reply was, you know, that's okay. Because if we think we've answered the tough questions, we need to go back and ask them again. My hope is to shed a little light through the lens of cosmopolitanism on the question of what we owe strangers. It's a tough question, so we should keep asking it. May it be so, and amen. Honey.
Oh, below me I feel no ocean, standing on these mountains and plains, far away from the rolling ocean. Still my dry land heart can say, I've been sailing all my life now, never harder on port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue home. Sun, my sail, and moon, my rudder, as I fly the starry sea, leaning over the edge in wonder, casting questions into the deep. Drifting here with my ship's companions, all we kindred pilgrim souls, making our way by the light of the heavens in our beautiful blue boat. Let us now have our chalice extinguished. And now for our closing words.
In closing, we have these words by Cynthia Landrum. We leave this gathered community, but we don't leave our connection, our concerns, our care for each other. Our service to each other, to the world, and to our faith continues. Until we are together again, friends, be strong, be well, be true, be loving. Finally, our announcement. Please check our website, the Quill, and the e-news for our current virtual events. Thank you for viewing our service today. Go in peace and enjoy your day.